Section 13 of Letters of Pliny by Pliny the Younger, translated by William Melmoth, revised by F.C.T. Bosanquet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Letters 84 to 89. Letter 84. To Septitius. You tell me certain persons have blamed me in your company, as being upon all occasions too lavish in the praise I give my friends. I not only acknowledge the charge, but glory in it; for can there be a nobler error than an overflowing benevolence? But still, who are these, let me ask, that are better acquainted with my friends than I am myself? Yet grant there are any such, why will they deny me the satisfaction of so pleasing a mistake? For supposing my friends not to deserve the highest encomiums I give them, yet I am happy in believing they do. Let them recommend then this malignant zeal to those, and their number is not inconsiderable, who imagine they show their judgment when they indulge their censure upon their friends. As for myself, they will never be able to persuade me I can be guilty of an excess in friendship. Farewell. Letter 85. To Tacitus. I predict, and I am persuaded I shall not be deceived, that your histories will be immortal. I frankly own, therefore, I so much the more earnestly wish to find a place in them. If we are generally careful to have our faces taken by the best artists, ought we not to desire that our actions may be celebrated by an author of your distinguished abilities? I therefore call your attention to the following matter, which, though it cannot have escaped your notice, as it is mentioned in the public journals, still I call your attention to, that you may the more readily believe how agreeable it will be to me that this action, greatly heightened by the risk which attended it, should receive additional lustre from the testimony of a man of your powers. The senate appointed Herennius Senecio and myself counsel for the province of Baetica, in their impeachment of Boebius Massa. He was condemned, and the house ordered his effects to be seized into the hands of the public officer. Shortly after, Senecio, having learnt that the consuls intended to sit to hear petitions, came and said to me, "Let us go together, and petition them with the same unanimity in which we executed the office which had been enjoined us, not to suffer Massa's effects to be dissipated by those who were appointed to preserve them." I answered, "As we were counsel in this affair by order of the senate, I recommend it to your consideration whether it would be proper for us, after sentence passed, to interpose any further." "You are at liberty," said he, "to prescribe what bounds you please to yourself, who have no particular connections with the province, except what arise from your late services to them. But then I was born there, and enjoyed the post of quaestor among them. If such," I replied, "is your determined resolution, I am ready to accompany you, that whatever resentment may be the consequence of this affair, it may not fall singly upon yourself." We accordingly proceeded to the consul's, where Senecio said what was pertinent to the affair, and I added a few words to the same effect. Scarcely had we ended when Massa, complaining that Senecio had not acted against him with the fidelity of an advocate, but the bitterness of an enemy, desired he might be at liberty to prosecute him for treason. This occasioned general consternation; whereupon I rose up. "Most noble consuls," said I am afraid it should seem that Massa has tacitly charged me with having favoured him in this cause, since he did not think proper to join me with Senecio in the desired prosecution. His short speech was immediately received with applause, and afterwards got much talked about everywhere. The late Emperor Nerva, who though at that time in a private station, yet interested himself in every meritorious action performed in public, wrote a most impressive letter to me upon the occasion, in which he not only congratulated me, but the age which had produced an example so much in the spirit, as he was pleased to call it, of the good old days. But, whatever be the actual fact, it lies in your power to raise it into a grander and more conspicuously illustrious position, though I am far from desiring you in the least to exceed the bounds of reality. History ought to be guided by strict truth, and worthy actions require nothing more. Farewell. LXXXVI To Septitius. I had a good journey here, excepting only that some of my servants were upset by the excessive heat. Poor Encolpius, my reader, who is so indispensable to me in my studies and amusements, was so affected with the dust that it brought on a spitting of blood, an accident which will prove no less unpleasant to me than unfortunate to himself, should he be thereby rendered unfit for the literary work in which he so greatly excels. If that should unhappily result, where shall I find one who will read my works so well, or appreciate them so thoroughly as he? Whose tones will my ears drink in as they do his? But the gods seem to favour our better hopes, as the bleeding is stopped, and the pain abated. Besides, he is extremely temperate, while no concern is wanting on my part, or care on his physicians. This, together with the wholesomeness of the air, and the quiet of retirement, gives us reason to expect that the country will contribute as much to the restoration of his health as to his rest. Farewell. LXXXVII To Calvisius. Other people visit their estates in order to recruit their purses, whilst I go to mine only to return so much the poorer. I had sold my vintage to the merchants, who were extremely eager to purchase it, encouraged by the price it then bore, and what it was probable it would rise to. However, they were disappointed in their expectations. Upon this occasion to have made the same general abatement to all would have been much the easiest, though not so equitable a method. Now I hold it particularly worthy of a man of honour to be governed by principles of strict equity in his domestic as well as public conduct, in little matters as in great ones, in his own concerns as well as in those of others. And if every deviation from rectitude is equally criminal, every approach to it must be equally praiseworthy. So accordingly I remitted to all in general 1/8 part of the price they had agreed to give me, that none might go away without some compensation. Next, I particularly considered those who had advanced the largest sums towards their purchase, and done me so much the more service, and been greater sufferers themselves. To those, therefore, whose purchase amounted to more than 10,000 sesterces, I returned, over and above that which I may call the general and common eighth, 1/10 part of what they had paid beyond that sum. I fear I do not express myself sufficiently clearly. I will endeavour to explain my meaning more fully. For instance, suppose a man had purchased of me to the value of 15,000 sesterces. I remitted to him 1/8 part of that whole sum, and likewise 1/10 of 5,000. Besides this, as several had deposited, in different proportions, part of the price they had agreed to pay, whilst others had advanced nothing, I thought it would not be at all fair that all these should be favoured with the same undistinguished remission. To those, therefore, who had made any payments, I returned a tenth part upon the sum so paid. By this means I made a proper acknowledgment to each, according to their respective deserts, and likewise encouraged them, not only to deal with me for the future, but to be prompt in their payments. This instance of my good nature or my judgment, call it which you please, was a considerable expense to me. However, I found my account in it; for all the country greatly approved both of the novelty of these abatements, and the manner in which I regulated them. Even those whom I did not meet, as they say, by the same measure, but distinguished according to their several degrees, thought themselves obliged to me in proportion to the probity of their principles, and went away pleased with having experienced that not with me the brave and mean an equal honour find. Farewell. LXXXVIII To Romanus. Have you ever seen the source of the river Clitumnus? If you have not, and I hardly think you can have seen it yet, or you would have told me, go there as soon as possible. I saw it yesterday, and I blame myself for not having seen it sooner. At the foot of a little hill, well wooded with old cypress trees, a spring gushes out, which, breaking up into different and unequal streams, forms itself, after several windings, into a large, broad basin of water, so transparently clear that you may count the shining pebbles, and the little pieces of money thrown into it, as they lie at the bottom. From thence it is carried off not so much by the declivity of the ground as by its own weight and exuberance; a mere stream at its source. Immediately on quitting this you find it expanded into a broad river, fit for large vessels even, allowing a free passage by each other, according as they sail with or against the stream. The current runs so strong, though the ground is level, that the large barges going down the river have no occasion to make use of their oars, while those going up find it difficult to make headway even with the assistance of oars and poles. And this alternate interchange of ease and toil, according as you turn, is exceedingly amusing when one sails up and down merely for pleasure. The banks are well covered with ash and poplar, the shape and colour of the trees being as clearly and distinctly reflected in the stream as if they were actually sunk in it. The water is cold as snow, and as white too. Near it stands an ancient and venerable temple, in which is placed the river god Clitumnus, clothed in the usual robe of state; and indeed the prophetic oracles here delivered sufficiently testify the immediate presence of that divinity. Several little chapels are scattered round, dedicated to particular gods, distinguished each by his own peculiar name and form of worship, and some of them too presiding over different fountains. For, besides the principal spring, which is, as it were, the parent of all the rest, there are several other lesser streams, which, taking their rise from various sources, lose themselves in the river, over which a bridge is built that separates the sacred part from that which lies open to common use. Vessels are allowed to come above this bridge, but no person is permitted to swim except below it. The Hesperides, to whom Augustus gave this place, furnish a public bath, and likewise entertain all strangers, at their own expense. Several villas, attracted by the beauty of this river, stand about on its borders. In short, every surrounding object will afford you entertainment. You may also amuse yourself with numberless inscriptions upon the pillars and walls, by different persons, celebrating the virtues of the fountain, and the divinity that presides over it. Many of them you will admire, while some will make you laugh. But I must correct myself when I say so; you are too humane, I know, to laugh upon such an occasion. Farewell. LXXXIX To Aristo. As you are no less acquainted with the political laws of your country, which include the customs and usages of the senate, than with the civil, I am particularly desirous to have your opinion whether I was mistaken in an affair which lately came before the house, or not. This I request, not with the view of being directed in my judgment as to what is past, for that is now too late, but in order to know how to act in any possible future case of the kind. You will ask, perhaps, why do you apply for information concerning a point on which you ought to be well instructed? Because the tyranny of former reigns, as it introduced a neglect and ignorance of all other parts of useful knowledge, so particularly of what relates to the customs of the senate. For who is there so tamely industrious as to desire to learn what he can never have an opportunity of putting in practice? Besides, it is not very easy to retain even the knowledge one has acquired, where no opportunity of employing it occurs. Hence it was that Liberty on her return found us totally ignorant and inexperienced, and thus, in the warmth of our eagerness to taste her sweets, we are sometimes hurried on to action ere we are well instructed how we ought to act. But by the institution of our ancestors, it was wisely provided that the young should learn from the old, not only by precept, but by their own observation, how to behave in that sphere in which they were one day themselves to move, while these again, in their turn, transmitted the same mode of instruction to their children. Upon this principle it was that the youth were sent early into the army, that by being taught to obey they might learn to command, and, whilst they followed others, might be trained by degrees to become leaders themselves. On the same principle, when they were candidates for any office, they were obliged to stand at the door of the senate house, and were spectators of the public council before they became members of it. The father of each youth was his instructor upon these occasions, or if he had none, some person of years and dignity supplied the place of a father. Thus they were taught by that surest method of discipline, example, how far the right of proposing any law to the senate extended, what privileges a senator had in delivering his opinion in the house, the power of the magistrates in that assembly, and the rights of the rest of the members, where it is proper to yield and where to insist, when and how long to speak and when to be silent, how to make necessary distinctions between contrary opinions, and how to improve upon a former motion. In a word, they learnt by this means every senatorial usage. As for myself, it is true indeed I served in the army when I was a youth, but it was at a time when courage was suspected, and want of spirit rewarded, when generals were without authority, and soldiers without modesty, when there was neither discipline nor obedience, but all was riot, disorder, and confusion; in short, when it was happier to forget than to remember what one learnt. I attended likewise in my youth the senate, but a senate shrinking and speechless, where it was dangerous to utter one's opinion, and mean and pitiable to be silent. What pleasure was there in learning, or indeed what could be learnt, when the senate was convened either to do nothing whatever, or to give their sanction to some consummate infamy; when they were assembled either for cruel or ridiculous purposes, and when their deliberations were never serious, though often sad. But I was not only a witness to this scene of wretchedness as a spectator, I bore my share of it too as a senator, and both saw and suffered under it for many years, which so broke and damped my spirits that they have not even yet been able fully to recover themselves. It is within quite recently, for all time seems short in proportion to its happiness, that we could take any pleasure in knowing what relates to, or in setting about the duties of our station. Upon these considerations, therefore, I may the more reasonably entreat you, in the first place to pardon my error, if I have been guilty of one, and, in the next, to lead me out of it by your superior knowledge; for you have always been diligent to examine into the constitution of your country, both with respect to its public and private, its ancient and modern, its general and special laws. I am persuaded indeed the point upon which I am going to consult you is such an unusual one, that even those whose great experience in public business must have made them, one would have naturally supposed, acquainted with everything, were either doubtful or absolutely ignorant upon it. I shall be more excusable, therefore, if I happen to have been mistaken, as you will earn the higher praise if you can set me right in an affair which it is not clear has ever yet fallen within your observation. The enquiry then before the house was concerning the freedman of Afranius Dexter, who being found murdered, it was uncertain whether he fell by his own hands, or by those of his household; and if the latter, whether they committed the fact in obedience to the commands of Afranius, or were prompted to it by their own villainy. After they had been put to the question, a certain senator, it is of no importance to mention his name, but if you are desirous to know, it was myself, was for acquitting them. Another proposed that they should be banished for a limited time, and a third that they should suffer death. These several opinions were so extremely different that it was impossible either of them could stand with the other. For what have death and banishment in common with one another? Why, no more than banishment and acquittal have together, though an acquittal approaches rather nearer a sentence of exile than a sentence of death does; for both the former agree at least in this, that they spare life, whereas the latter takes it away. In the meanwhile, those senators who were for punishing with death, and those who proposed banishment, sate together on the same side of the house, and thus by a present appearance of unanimity suspended their real disagreement. I moved, therefore, that the votes for each of the three opinions should be separately taken, and that two of them should not, under favour of a short truce between themselves, join against the third. I insisted that such of the members who were for capital punishment should divide from the others who voted for banishment, and that these two distinct parties should not be permitted to form themselves into a body in opposition to those who declared for acquittal, when they would immediately after disunite again. For it was not material that they agreed in disliking one proposal, since they differed with respect to the other two. It seemed very extraordinary that he who moved the freedmen should be banished, and the slaves suffer death, should not be allowed to join these two in one motion, but that each question should be ordered to be put to the House separately; and yet that the votes of one who was for inflicting capital punishment upon the freedmen should be taken together with that of one who was for banishing them. For if, in the former instance, it was reasonable that the motion should be divided, because it comprehended two distinct propositions, I could not see why, in the latter case, suffrages so extremely different should be thrown into the same scale. Permit me then, notwithstanding the point is already settled, to go over it again, as if it were still undecided, and to lay before you those reasons at my ease, which I offered to the House in the midst of much interruption and clamour. Let us suppose there had been only 3 judges appointed to hear this cause, one of whom was of opinion that the parties in question deserved death, the other that they should only be banished, and the third that they ought to be acquitted. Should the 2 former unite their weight to overpower the latter, or should each be separately balanced? For the first and second are no more compatible than the second and third. They ought therefore in the same manner to be counted in the senate as contrary opinions, since they were delivered as different ones. Suppose the same person had moved that they should both have been banished and put to death, could they possibly, in pursuance of this opinion, have suffered both punishments? Or could it have been looked upon as one consistent motion when it united 2 such different decisions? Why then should the same opinion, when delivered by distinct persons, be considered as one and entire, which would not be deemed so if it were proposed by a single man? Does not the law manifestly imply that a distinction is to be made between those who are for a capital conviction and those who are for banishment, in the very form of words made use of when the House is ordered to divide? You who are of such an opinion, come to this side; you who are of any other, go over to the side of him whose opinion you follow. Let us examine this form, and weigh every sentence. You who are of this opinion, that is, for instance, you who are for banishment, come on this side, namely on the side of him who moved for banishment, from whence it is clear he cannot remain on this side of those who are for death. You who are for any other, observe, the law is not content with barely saying another, but it adds any. Now can there be a doubt as to whether they who declare for a capital conviction are of any other opinion than those who propose exile? Go over to the side of him whose opinion you follow. Does not the law seem, as it were, to call, compel, drive over those who are of different opinions to contrary sides? Does not the consul himself point out, not only by this solemn form of words, but by his hand and gesture, the place in which every man is to remain, or to which he is to go over? But, it is objected, if this separation is made between those who vote for inflicting death and those who are on the side of exile, the opinion for acquitting the prisoners must necessarily prevail. But how does that affect the parties who vote? Certainly it does not become them to contend by every art, and urge every expedient, that the milder sentence may not take place. Still, say they, those who are for condemning the accused either capitally or to banishment should be first set in opposition to those who are for acquitting them, and afterwards weighed against each other. Thus, as in certain public games, some particular combatant is set apart by lot and kept to engage with the conqueror, so it seems in the senate there is a first and second combat, and of two different opinions, the prevailing one has still a third to contend with. What? When any particular opinion is received, do not all the rest fall of course? Is it reasonable, then, that one should be thrown into the scale merely to weigh down another? To express my meaning more plainly, unless the two parties who are respectively for capital punishment and exile immediately separate upon the first division of the house, it would be to no purpose afterwards to dissent from those with whom they joined before. But I am dictating instead of receiving instruction. Tell me then whether you think these votes should have been taken separately. My motion, it is true, prevailed. Nevertheless, I am desirous to know whether you think I ought to have insisted upon this point, or have yielded, as that member did who declared for capital punishment. For convinced, I will not say of the legality, but at least of the equity of my proposal, he receded from his opinion, and went over to the party for exile, fearing perhaps, if the votes were taken separately, which he saw would be the case, the freedmen would be acquitted; for the numbers were far greater on that side than on either of the other two, separately counted. The consequence was that those who had been influenced by his authority, when they saw themselves forsaken by his going over to the other party, gave up a motion which they found abandoned by the first proposer, and deserted, as it were, with their leader. Thus the three opinions were resolved at length into two, and of those two one prevailed and the other was rejected, while the third, as it was not powerful enough to conquer both the others, had only to choose to which of the two it would yield. Farewell. End of section 13. Section 14 of Letters of Pliny by Pliny the Younger, translated by William Melmoth, revised by F.C.T. Bosanquet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Letters 90 to 96. Letter 90. To Paternus. The sickness lately in my family, which has carried off several of my servants, some of them too in the prime of their years, has been a great affliction to me. I have two consolations, however, which, though by no means equivalent to such a grief, still are consolations. One is, that as I have always readily manumitted my slaves, their death does not seem altogether immature, if they live long enough to receive their freedom. The other, that I have allowed them to make a kind of will, which I observe as religiously as if they were legally entitled to that privilege. I receive and obey their last requests and injunctions as so many authoritative commands, suffering them to dispose of their effects to whom they please, with this single restriction, that they leave them to some one in my household; for to slaves, the house they are in is a kind of state and commonwealth, so to speak. But though I endeavour to acquiesce under these reflections, yet the same tenderness which led me to show them these indulgences weakens and gets the better of me. However, I would not wish on that account to become harder. Though the generality of the world, I know, look upon losses of this kind in no other view than as a diminution of their property, and fancy, by cherishing such an unfeeling temper, they show a superior fortitude and philosophy. Their fortitude and philosophy I will not dispute; but humane, I am sure, they are not. For it is the very criterion of true manhood to feel those impressions of sorrow which it endeavours to resist, and to admit not to be above the want of consolation. But perhaps I have detained you too long upon this subject, though not so long as I would. There is a certain pleasure even in giving vent to one's grief, especially when we weep on the bosom of a friend who will approve, or, at least, pardon our tears. Farewell. XCI To Macrinus. Is the weather with you as rude and boisterous as it is with us? All here is in tempest and inundation. The Tiber has swelled its channel and overflowed its banks far and wide. Though the wise precaution of the emperor had guarded against this evil, by cutting several outlets to the river, it has nevertheless flooded all the fields and valleys, and entirely overspread the whole face of the flat country. It seems to have gone out to meet those rivers which it used to receive and carry off in one united stream, and has driven them back to deluge those countries it could not reach itself. That most delightful of rivers, the Anio, which seems invited and detained in its course by the villas built along its banks, has almost entirely rooted up and carried away the woods which shaded its borders. It has overthrown whole mountains, and, in endeavouring to find a passage through the mass of ruins that obstructed its way, has forced down houses, and risen and spread over the desolation it has occasioned. The inhabitants of the hill countries, who are situated above the reach of this inundation, have been the melancholy spectators of its dreadful effects, having seen costly furniture, instruments of husbandry, ploughs, and oxen with their drivers, whole herds of cattle, together with the trunks of trees and beams of the neighbouring villas, floating about in different parts. Nor indeed have these higher places themselves, to which the waters could not reach up, escaped the calamity. A continued heavy rain and tempestuous hurricane, as destructive as the river itself, poured down upon them, and has destroyed all the enclosures which divided that fertile country. It has damaged likewise, and even overturned, some of the public buildings, by the fall of which great numbers have been maimed, smothered, bruised. And thus lamentation over the fate of friends has been added to losses. I am extremely uneasy, lest this extensive ruin should have spread to you. I beg, therefore, if it has not, you will immediately relieve my anxiety; and indeed I desire you would inform me though it should have done so, for the difference is not great between fearing a danger and feeling it, except that the evil one feels has some bounds, whereas one's apprehensions have none; for we can suffer no more than what actually has happened, but we fear all that possibly could happen. Farewell. XCII To Rufinus. The common notion is certainly quite a false one, that a man's will is a kind of mirror in which we may clearly discern his real character. For Domitius Tullus appears a much better man since his death than he did during his lifetime. After having artfully encouraged the expectations of those who paid court to him, with a view to being his heirs, he has left his estate to his niece, whom he adopted. He has given likewise several very considerable legacies among his grandchildren, and also to his great grandson. In a word, he has shown himself a most kind relation throughout his whole will, which is so much the more to be admired, as it was not expected of him. This affair has been very much talked about, and various opinions expressed. Some call him false, ungrateful, and forgetful; and, while thus railing at him in this way as if they were actually disinherited kindred, betray their own dishonest designs. Others, on the contrary, applaud him extremely for having disappointed the hopes of this infamous tribe of men, whom, considering the disposition of the times, it is but prudence to deceive. They add that he was not at liberty to make any other will, and that he cannot so properly be said to have bequeathed as returned his estate to his adopted daughter, since it was by her means it came to him. For Curtilius Mancia, whose daughter Domitius Lucanus, brother to this Tullus, married, having taken a dislike to his son-in-law, made this young lady, who was the issue of that marriage, his heiress, upon condition that Lucanus her father would emancipate her. He accordingly did so, but she being afterwards adopted by Tullus, her uncle, the design of Mancia's will was entirely frustrated. For these two brothers having never divided their patrimony, but living together as joint tenants of one common estate, the daughter of Lucanus, notwithstanding the act of emancipation, returned back again, together with her large fortune, under the dominion of her father, by means of this fraudulent adoption. It seems indeed to have been the fate of these two brothers to be enriched by those who had the greatest aversion to them. For Domitius Afer, by whom they were adopted, left a will in their favour, which he had made 18 years before his death, though it was plain he had since altered his opinion with regard to the family, because he was instrumental in procuring the confiscation of their father's estate. There is something extremely singular in the resentment of Afer, and the good fortune of the other two; as it was very extraordinary, on the one hand, that Domitius should endeavour to extirpate from the privileges of society a man whose children he had adopted, and, on the other, that these brothers should find a parent in the very person that ruined their father. But Tullus acted justly, after having been appointed sole heir by his brother, in prejudice to his own daughter, to make her amends by transferring to her this estate, which came to him from Afer, as well as all the rest which he had gained in partnership with his brother. His will therefore deserves the higher praise, having been dictated by nature, justice, and sense of honour, in which he has returned his obligations to his several relations, according to their respective good offices towards him, not forgetting his wife, having bequeathed to that excellent woman, who patiently endured much for his sake, several delightful villas, besides a large sum of money. And indeed she deserved so much the more at his hands, in proportion to the displeasure she incurred on her marriage with him. It was thought unworthy a person of her birth and repute, so long left a widow by her former husband, by whom she had issue, to marry, in the decline of her life, an old man, merely for his wealth, and who was so sickly and infirm that, even had he passed the best years of his youth and health with her, she might well have been heartily tired of him. He had so entirely lost the use of all his limbs that he could not move himself in bed without assistance, and the only enjoyment he had of his riches was to contemplate them. He was even, sad and disgusting to relate, reduced to the necessity of having his teeth washed and scrubbed by others, in allusion to which he used frequently to say, when he was complaining of the indignities which his infirmities obliged him to suffer, that he was every day compelled to lick his servants' fingers. Still, however, he lived on, and was willing to accept of life upon such terms. That he lived so long as he did was particularly owing, indeed, to the care of his wife, who, whatever reputation she might lose at first by her marriage, acquired great honour by her unwearied devotion as his wife. Thus I have given you all the news of the town, where nothing is talked of but Tullus. It is expected his curiosities will shortly be sold by auction. He had such an abundant collection of very old statues that he actually filled an extensive garden with them, the very same day he purchased it; not to mention numberless other antiques, lying neglected in his lumber room. If you have anything worth telling me in return, I hope you will not refuse the trouble of writing to me, not only as we are all of us naturally fond, you know, of news, but because example has a very beneficial influence upon our own conduct. Farewell. XCIII To Gallus. Those works of art or nature which are usually the motives of our travels are often overlooked and neglected if they lie within our reach; whether it be that we are naturally less inquisitive concerning those things which are near us, while our curiosity is excited by remote objects, or because the easiness of gratifying a desire is always sure to damp it, or, perhaps, that we put off from time to time going and seeing what we know we have an opportunity of seeing when we please. Whatever the reason be, it is certain there are numberless curiosities in and near Rome which we have not only never seen, but even never so much as heard of; and yet, had they been the produce of Greece, or Egypt, or Asia, or any other country which we admire as fertile and productive of belief in wonders, we should long since have heard of them, read of them, and enquired into them. For myself at least, I confess, I have lately been entertained with one of these curiosities, to which I was an entire stranger before. My wife's grandfather desired I would look over his estate near Ameria. As I was walking over his grounds, I was shown a lake that lies below them, called Vadirnon, about which several very extraordinary things are told. I went up to this lake. It is perfectly circular in form, like a wheel lying on the ground. There is not the least curve or projection of the shore, but all is regular, even, and just as if it had been hollowed and cut out by the hand of art. The water is of a clear sky blue, though with somewhat of a greenish tinge. Its smell is sulphurous, and its flavour has medicinal properties, and is deemed of great efficacy in all fractures of the limbs, which it is supposed to heal. Though of but moderate extent, yet the winds have a great effect upon it, throwing it into violent agitation. No vessels are suffered to sail here, as its waters are held sacred; but several floating islands swim about it, covered with reeds and rushes, and with whatever other plants the surrounding marshy ground and the edge itself of the lake produce in greater abundance. Each island has its peculiar shape and size, but the edges of all of them are worn away by their frequent collision with the shore and one another. They are all of the same height and motion, as their respective roots, which are formed like the keel of a boat, may be seen hanging not very far down in the water, and at an equal depth, on whichever side you stand. Sometimes they move in a cluster, and seem to form one entire little continent; sometimes they are dispersed into different quarters by the wind; at other times, when it is calm, they float up and down separately. You may frequently see one of the larger islands sailing along with a lesser joined to it, like a ship with its long boat; or perhaps seeming to strive which shall outswim the other. Then again they are all driven to the same spot, and by joining themselves to the shore, sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other, lessen or restore the size of the lake in this part or that accordingly, till at last uniting in the centre they restore it to its usual size. The sheep which graze upon the borders of this lake frequently go upon these islands to feed, without perceiving that they have left the shore, until they are alarmed by finding themselves surrounded with water, as though they had been forcibly conveyed and placed there. Afterwards, when the wind drives them back again, they as little perceive their return as their departure. This lake empties itself into a river, which, after running a little way, sinks under ground, and, if anything is thrown in, it brings it up again where the stream emerges. I have given you this account because I imagined it would not be less new, nor less agreeable to you than it was to me, as I know you take the same pleasure as myself in contemplating the works of nature. Farewell. XCIV To Arrianus. Nothing, in my opinion, gives a more amiable and becoming grace to our studies, as well as manners, than to temper the serious with the gay, lest the former should degenerate into melancholy, and the latter run up into levity. Upon this plan it is that I diversify my graver works with compositions of a lighter nature. I had chosen a convenient place and season for some productions of that sort to make their appearance in, and designing to accustom them early to the tables of the idle, I fixed upon the month of July, which is usually a time of vacation to the courts of justice, in order to read them to some of my friends I had collected together, and accordingly I placed a desk before each couch. But as I happened that morning to be unexpectedly called away to attend a cause, I took occasion to preface my recital with an apology. I entreated my audience not to impute it to me as any want of due regard for the business to which I had invited them that on the very day I had appointed for reading my performances to a small circle of my friends I did not refuse my services to others in their law affairs. I assured them I would observe the same rule in my writings, and should always give the preference to business before pleasure, to serious engagements before amusing ones, and to my friends before myself. The poems I recited consisted of a variety of subjects in different metres. It is thus that we who dare not rely for much upon our abilities endeavour to avoid satiating our readers. In compliance with the earnest solicitation of my audience, I recited for 2 days successively, but not in the manner that several practise, by passing over the feebler passages, and making a merit of so doing. On the contrary, I omitted nothing, and freely confessed it. I read the whole, that I might correct the whole, which it is impossible those who only select particular passages can do. The latter method, indeed, may have more the appearance of modesty, and perhaps respect, but the former shows greater simplicity, as well as a more affectionate disposition towards the audience. For the belief that a man's friends have so much regard for him as not to be weary on these occasions is a sure indication of the love he bears them. Otherwise, what good do friends do you who assemble merely for their own amusement? He who had rather find his friend's performance correct than make it so is to be regarded as a stranger, or one who is too lackadaisical to give himself any trouble. Your affection for me leaves me no room to doubt that you are impatient to read my book, even in its present very imperfect condition, and so you shall, but not until I have made those corrections which were the principal inducement of my recital. You are already acquainted with some parts of it, but even those, after they have been improved, or perhaps spoiled, as is sometimes the case, by the delay of excessive revision, will seem quite new to you. For when a piece has undergone various changes, it gets to look new, even in those very parts which remain unaltered. Farewell. XCV To Maximus. My affection for you obliges me, not indeed to direct you, for you are far above the want of a guide, but to admonish you carefully to observe and resolutely to put in practice what you already know; that is, in other words, to know it to better purpose. Consider that you are sent to that noble province Achaia, the real and genuine Greece, where politeness, learning, and even agriculture itself are supposed to have taken their first rise; sent to regulate the condition of free cities; sent, that is, to a society of men who breathe the spirit of true manhood and liberty, who have maintained the rights they received from nature, by courage, by virtue, by alliances; in a word, by civil and religious faith. Revere the gods their founders; their ancient glory, and even that very antiquity itself which, venerable in men, is sacred in states. Honour them therefore for their deeds of old renown, nay, their very legendary traditions. Grant to every one his full dignity, privileges, yes, and the indulgence of his very vanity. Remember it was from this nation we derived our laws, that she did not receive ours by conquest, but gave us hers by favour. Remember it is Athens to which you go, it is Lacedaemon you govern; and to deprive such a people of the declining shadow, the remaining name of liberty, would be cruel, inhuman, barbarous. Physicians, you see, though in sickness there is no difference between freedom and slavery, yet treat persons of the former rank with more tenderness than those of the latter. Reflect what these cities once were, but so reflect as not to despise them for what they are now. Far be pride and asperity from my friend, nor fear, by a proper condescension, to lay yourself open to contempt. Can he who is vested with the power, and bears the ensigns of authority, can he fail of meeting with respect, unless by pursuing base and sordid measures, and first breaking through that reverence he owes to himself? Ill, believe me, is power proved by insult; ill can terror command veneration, and far more effectual is affection in obtaining one's purpose than fear; for terror operates no longer than its object is present, but love produces its effects with its object at a distance, and as absence changes the former into hatred, it raises the latter into respect. And therefore you ought, and I cannot but repeat it too often, you ought to well consider the nature of your office, and to represent to yourself how great and important the task is of governing a free state. For what can be better for society than such government, what can be more precious than freedom? How ignominious then must his conduct be who turns good government into anarchy, and liberty into slavery! To these considerations let me add, that you have an established reputation to maintain, the fame you acquired by the administration of the quaestorship in Bithynia, the good opinion of the emperor, the credit you obtained when you were tribune and praetor; in a word, this very government, which may be looked upon as the reward of your former services, are all so many glorious weights which are incumbent upon you to support with suitable dignity. The more strenuously, therefore, you ought to endeavour that it may not be said you showed greater urbanity, integrity, and ability in a province remote from Rome, than in one which lies so much nearer the capital, in the midst of a nation of slaves, than among a free people; that it may not be remarked that it was chance, and not judgment, appointed you to this office, that your character was unknown and unexperienced, not tried and approved. For, and it is a maxim which your reading and conversation must have often suggested to you, it is a far greater disgrace losing the name one has once acquired than never to have attained it. I again beg you to be persuaded that I did not write this letter with the design of instruction, but of reminder; though indeed, if I had, it would have only been in consequence of the great affection I bear you, a sentiment which I am in no fear of carrying beyond its just bounds, for there can be no danger of excess where one cannot love too well. Farewell. XCVI To Paulinus. Others may think as they please, but the happiest man, in my opinion, is he who lives in the conscious anticipation of an honest and enduring name, and secure of future glory in the eyes of posterity. I confess, if I had not the reward of an immortal reputation in view, I should prefer a life of uninterrupted ease and indolent retirement to any other. There seems to be two points worthy every man's attention: endless fame, or the short duration of life. Those who are actuated by the former motive ought to exert themselves to the very utmost of their power, while such as are influenced by the latter should quietly resign themselves to repose, and not wear out a short life in perishable pursuits, as we see so many doing, and then sink at last into utter self-contempt in the midst of a wretched and fruitless course of false industry. These are my daily reflections, which I communicate to you in order to renounce them if you do not agree with them, as undoubtedly you will, who are for ever meditating some glorious and immortal enterprise. Farewell. End of Section 14. Section 15 of Letters of Pliny by Pliny the Younger, translated by William Melmoth, revised by F.C.T. Bosanquet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Section 15. Letters 97 to 105. Letter 97. To Calvisius. I have spent these several days past in reading and writing with the most pleasing tranquillity imaginable. You will ask, how can that possibly be in the midst of Rome? It was the time of celebrating the Circensian games, an entertainment for which I have not the least taste. They have no novelty, no variety to recommend them, nothing, in short, one would wish to see twice. It does the more surprise me, therefore, that so many thousand people should be possessed with the childish passion of desiring so often to see a parcel of horses gallop, and men standing upright in their chariots. If, indeed, it were the swiftness of the horses, or the skill of the men, that attracted them, there might be some pretence of reason for it. But it is the dress they like, it is the dress that takes their fancy. And if, in the midst of the course and contest, the different parties were to change colours, their different partisans would change sides, and instantly desert the very same men and horses, whom just before they were eagerly following with their eyes, as far as they could see, and shouting out their names with all their might. Such mighty charms, such wondrous power, reside in the colour of a paltry tunic; and this, not only with the common crowd, more contemptible than the dress they espouse, but even with serious thinking people. When I observe such men thus insatiably fond of so silly, so low, so uninteresting, so common an entertainment, I congratulate myself on my indifference to these pleasures, and am glad to employ the leisure of this season upon my books, which others throw away upon the most idle occupations. Farewell. XCVIII To Romanus. I am pleased to find by your letter that you are engaged in building, for I may now defend my own conduct by your example. I am myself employed in the same sort of work, and since I have you, who shall deny I have reason on my side? Our situations, too, are not dissimilar. Your buildings are carried on upon the sea coast, mine are rising upon the side of the Larian lake. I have several villas upon the borders of this lake, but there are two particularly in which, as I take most delight, so they give me most employment. They are both situated like those at Baiae; one of them stands upon a rock and overlooks the lake, the other actually touches it. The first, supported as it were by the lofty buskin, I call my tragic; the other, as resting upon the humble rock, my comic villa. Each has its own peculiar charm, recommending it to its possessor so much more on account of this very difference. The former commands a wider, the latter enjoys a nearer view of the lake. One, by a gentle curve, embraces a little bay; the other, being built upon a greater height, forms two. Here you have a straight walk, extending itself along the banks of the lake; there a spacious terrace that falls by a gentle descent towards it. The former does not feel the force of the waves, the latter breaks them. From that you see the fishing vessels; from this you may fish yourself, and throw your line out of your room, and almost from your bed, as from off a boat. It is the beauties, therefore, these agreeable villas possess, that tempt me to add to them those which are wanting. But I need not assign a reason to you, who undoubtedly will think it a sufficient one that I follow your example. Farewell. XCIX To Geminus. Your letter was particularly acceptable to me, as it mentioned your desire that I would send you something of mine, addressed to you, to insert in your works. I shall find a more appropriate occasion of complying with your request than that which you propose, the subject you point out to me being attended with some objections, and when you reconsider it you will think so. As I did not imagine there were any booksellers at Lugdunum, I am so much the more pleased to learn that my works are sold there. I rejoice to find they maintain the character abroad which they raised at home, and I begin to flatter myself they have some merit, since persons of such distant countries are agreed in their opinion with regard to them. Farewell. CX To Junia. A certain friend of mine lately chastised his son, in my presence, for being somewhat too expensive in the matter of dogs and horses. "And pray," I asked him when the youth had left us, "did you never commit a fault yourself which deserved your father's correction? Did you never, I repeat? Nay, are you not sometimes even now guilty of errors which your son, were he in your place, might with equal gravity reprove? Are not all mankind subject to indiscretions, and have we not each of us our particular follies in which we fondly indulge ourselves? The great affection I have for you induced me to set this instance of unreasonable severity before you, a caution not to treat your son with too much harshness and severity. Consider, he is but a boy, and that there was a time when you were so too. In exerting, therefore, the authority of a father, remember always that you are a man, and the parent of a man. Farewell. CI To Quadratus. The pleasure and attention with which you read the vindication I published of Helvidius has greatly raised your curiosity, it seems, to be informed of those particulars relating to that affair which are not mentioned in the defence, as you were too young to be present yourself at that transaction. When Domitian was assassinated, a glorious opportunity, I thought, offered itself to me of pursuing the guilty, vindicating the injured, and advancing my own reputation. But amidst an infinite variety of the blackest crimes, none appeared to me more atrocious than that a senator, of praetorian dignity and invested with the sacred character of a judge, should, even in the very senate itself, lay violent hands upon a member of that body, one of consular rank, and who then stood arraigned before him. Besides this general consideration, I also happened to be on terms of particular intimacy with Helvidius, as far as this was possible with one who, through fear of the times, endeavoured to veil the lustre of his fame and his virtues in obscurity and retirement. Arria likewise, and her daughter Fannia, who was mother-in-law to Helvidius, were in the number of my friends. But it was not so much private attachments as the honour of the public, a just indignation at the action, and the danger of the example if it should pass unpunished, that animated me upon the occasion. At the first restoration of liberty, every man singled out his own particular enemy, though it must be confessed, those only of a lower rank, and, in the midst of much clamour and confusion, no sooner brought the charge than procured the condemnation. But for myself, I thought it would be more reasonable and more effectual not to take advantage of the general resentment of the public, but to crush this criminal with a single weight of his own enormous guilt. When, therefore, the first heat of public indignation began to cool, and declining passion gave way to justice, though I was at that time under great affliction for the loss of my wife, I sent to Antea, the widow of Helvidius, and desired her to come to me, as my late misfortune prevented me from appearing in public. When she arrived, I said to her, "I am resolved not to suffer the injuries your husband has received to pass unrevenged. Let Arria and Fannia, who are just returned from exile, know this, and consider together whether you would care to join with me in the prosecution. Not that I want an associate, but I am not so jealous of my own glory as to refuse to share it with you in this affair." She accordingly carried this message, and they all agreed to the proposal without the least hesitation. It happened very opportunely that the senate was to meet within 3 days. It was a general rule with me to consult, in all my affairs, with Corellius, a person of the greatest far-sightedness and wisdom this age has produced. However, in the present case, I relied entirely upon my own discretion, being apprehensive he would not approve of my design, as he was very cautious and deliberate. But though I did not previously take counsel with him, experience having taught me never to do so with a person concerning a question we have already determined, where he has a right to expect that one shall be decided by his judgment, yet I could not forbear acquainting him with my resolution at the time I intended to carry it into execution. The senate being assembled, I came into the house, and begged I might have leave to make a motion, which I did in few words, and with general assent. When I began to touch upon the charge, and point out the person I intended to accuse, though as yet without mentioning him by name, I was attacked on all sides. "Let us know," exclaims one, "who is the subject of this informal motion?" "Who is it," asked another, "that is thus accused, without acquainting the House with his name and his crime?" "Surely," added a third, "we who have survived the late dangerous times may expect now, at least, to remain in security." I heard all this with perfect calmness, and without being in the least alarmed. Such is the effect of conscious integrity, and so much difference is there with respect to inspiring confidence or fear, whether the world had only rather one should forbear a certain act, or absolutely condemn it. It would be too tedious to relate all that was advanced by different parties upon this occasion. At length the consul said, "You will be at liberty, Secundus, to propose what you think proper when your turn comes to give your opinion upon the order of the day." I replied, "You must allow me a liberty which you never yet refused to any," and so sat down, when immediately the House went upon another business. In the meanwhile one of my consular friends took me aside, and, with great earnestness telling me he thought I had carried on this affair with more boldness than prudence, used every method of reproof and persuasion to prevail with me to desist, adding at the same time that I should certainly, if I persevered, render myself obnoxious to some future prince. "Be it so," I returned, "should he prove a bad one." Scarcely had he left me, when a second came up. "Whatever," said he, "are you attempting? Why ever will you ruin yourself? Do you consider the risks you expose yourself to? Why will you presume too much on the present situation of public affairs, when it is so uncertain what turn they may hereafter take? You are attacking a man who is actually at the head of the treasury, and will shortly be consul. Besides, recollect what credit he has, and with what powerful friendships he is supported." Upon which he named a certain person, who, not without several strong and suspicious rumours, was then at the head of a powerful army in the East. I replied, "All I've foreseen, and oft in thought revolved, and am willing, if fate shall so decree, to suffer in an honest cause, provided I can draw vengeance down upon a most infamous one." The time for the members to give their opinions was now arrived. Domitius Apollinaris, the consul elect, spoke first; after him Fabricius Vejento; then Fabius Maximinus; Vettius Proculus next, who married my wife's mother, and who was the colleague of Publicius Certus, the person on whom the debate turned; and last of all Ammius Flaccus. They all defended Certus, as if I had named him, though I had not yet so much as once mentioned him, and entered upon his justification as if I had exhibited a specific charge. It is not necessary to repeat in this place what they respectively said, having given it all at length in their words in the speech above mentioned. Avidius Quietus and Cornutus Tertullus answered them. The former observed, that it was extremely unjust not to hear the complaints of those who thought themselves injured, and therefore that Arria and Fannia ought not to be denied the privilege of laying their grievances before the house, and that the point for the consideration of the senate was not the rank of the person, but the merit of the cause. Then Cornutus rose up, and acquainted the house, that, as he was appointed guardian to the daughter of Helvidius by the consuls, upon the petition of her mother and her father in law, he felt himself compelled to fulfil the duty of his trust; in the execution of which, however, he would endeavour to set some bounds to his indignation, by following that great example of moderation which those excellent women had set, who contented themselves with barely informing the senate of the cruelties which Certus committed in order to carry on his infamous adulation; and therefore, he said, he would move only that, if a punishment due to a crime so notoriously known should be remitted, Certus might at least be branded with some mark of the displeasure of that august assembly. Satrius Rufus spoke next, and, meaning to steer a middle course, expressed himself with considerable ambiguity. "I am of opinion," said he, "that great injustice will be done to Certus if he is not acquitted; for I do not scruple to mention his name, since the friends of Arria and Fannia, as well as his own, have done so too. Nor indeed have we any occasion for anxiety upon this account. We who think well of the man shall judge him with the same impartiality as the rest; but if he is innocent, as I hope he is, and shall be glad to find, I think this house may very justly deny the present motion, till some charge has been proved against him." Thus, according to the respective order in which they were called upon, they delivered their several opinions. When it came to my turn, I rose up, and, using the same introduction to my speech as I have published in the defence, I replied to them severally. It is surprising with what attention, what clamorous applause I was heard, even by those who just before were loudest against me. Such a wonderful change was wrought either by the importance of the affair, the successful progress of the speech, or the resolution of the advocate. After I had finished, Vejento attempted to reply; but the general clamour raised against him not permitting him to go on, "I entreat you, conscript fathers," said he, "not to oblige me to implore the assistance of the tribunes." Immediately the tribune Murena cried out, "You have my permission, most illustrious Vejento, to go on." But still the clamour was renewed. In the interval the consul ordered the house to divide, and having counted the voices, dismissed the senate, leaving Vejento in the midst, still attempting to speak. He made great complaints of this affront, as he called it, applying the following lines of Homer to himself: "Great perils, father, wait the unequal fight; Those younger champions will thy strength o'ercome." There was hardly a man in the senate that did not embrace and kiss me, and all strove who should applaud me most, for having, at the cost of private enmities, revived a custom so long disused, of freely consulting the senate upon affairs that concern the honour of the public; in a word, for having wiped off that reproach which was thrown upon it by other orders in the state, that the senators mutually favoured the members of their own body, while they were very severe in animadverting upon the rest of their fellow citizens. All this was transacted in the absence of Certus, who kept out of the way, either because he suspected something of this nature was intended to be moved, or, as was alleged in his excuse, that he was really unwell. Caesar, however, did not refer the examination of this matter to the senate, but I succeeded, nevertheless, in my aim, another person being appointed to succeed Certus in the consulship, while the election of his colleague to that office was confirmed. And thus the wish with which I concluded my speech was actually accomplished. "May he be obliged," said I, "to renounce, under a virtuous prince, that reward he received from an infamous one." Some time after I recollected, as well as I could, the speech I had made upon this occasion, to which I made several additions. It happened, though indeed it had the appearance of being something more than casual, that a few days after I had published this piece, Certus was taken ill and died. I was told that his imagination was continually haunted with this affair, and kept picturing me ever before his eyes as a man pursuing him with a drawn sword. Whether there was any truth in this rumour I will not venture to assert; but, for the sake of example, however, I could wish it might gain credit. And now I have sent you a letter which, considering it is a letter, is as long as the defence you say you have read; but you must thank yourself for not being content with such information as that piece could afford you. Farewell. CII To Genitor. I have received your letter, in which you complain of having been highly disgusted lately at a very splendid entertainment by a set of buffoons, mummers, and wanton prostitutes, who were dancing about round the tables. But let me advise you to smooth your knitted brows somewhat. I confess, indeed, I admit nothing of this kind at my own house; however, I bear with it in others. And why then, you'll be ready to ask, not have them yourself? The truth is, because the gestures of the wanton, the pleasantries of the buffoon, or the extravagancies of the mummer, give me no pleasure, as they give me no surprise. It is my particular taste, you see, not my judgment, that I plead against them. And indeed what numbers are there who think the entertainments with which you and I are most delighted no better than impertinent follies? How many are there who, as soon as a reader, a lyarist, or a comedian is introduced, either take their leave of the company, or, if they remain, show as much dislike to this sort of thing as you did to those monsters, as you call them. Let us bear, therefore, my friend, with others in their amusements, that they, in return, may show indulgence to ours. Farewell. CIII To Sabinianus. Your freedman, whom you lately mentioned to me with displeasure, has been with me, and threw himself at my feet with as much submission as he could have fallen at yours. He earnestly requested me with many tears, and even with all the eloquence of silent sorrow, to intercede for him. In short, he convinced me by his whole behaviour that he sincerely repents of his fault. I am persuaded he is thoroughly reformed, because he seems deeply sensible of his guilt. I know you are angry with him, and I know too it is not without reason. But clemency can never exert itself more laudably than when there is the most cause for resentment. You once had an affection for this man, and, I hope, will have again. Meanwhile, let me only prevail with you to pardon him. If he should incur your displeasure hereafter, you will have so much the stronger plea in excuse for your anger, as you show yourself more merciful to him now. Concede something to his youth, to his tears, and to your own natural mildness of temper. Do not make him uneasy any longer, and I will add too, do not make yourself so; for a man of your kindness of heart cannot be angry without feeling great uneasiness. I am afraid, were I to join my entreaties with his, I should seem rather to compel than request you to forgive him; yet I will not scruple even to write mine with his, and in so much the stronger terms as I have very sharply and severely reproved him, positively threatening never to interpose again in his behalf. But though it was proper to say this to him, in order to make him more fearful of offending, I do not say so to you. I may, perhaps, again have occasion to entreat you upon this account, and again obtain your forgiveness; supposing, I mean, his fault should be such as may become me to intercede for, and you to pardon. Farewell. CIV To Maximus. It has frequently happened, as I have been pleading before the court of the 100, that these venerable judges, after having preserved for a long period the gravity and solemnity suitable to their character, have suddenly, as though urged by irresistible impulse, risen up to a man and applauded me. I have often likewise gained as much glory in the senate as my utmost wishes could desire; but I never felt a more sensible pleasure than by an account which I lately received from Cornelius Tacitus. He informed me that, at the last Circensian games, he sat next to a Roman knight, who, after conversation had passed between them upon various points of learning, asked him, "Are you an Italian or a provincial?" Tacitus replied, "Your acquaintance with literature must surely have informed you who I am. Pray then, is it Tacitus or Pliny I am talking with?" I cannot express how highly I am pleased to find that our names are not so much the proper appellatives of men, as a kind of distinction for learning herself, and that eloquence renders us known to those who would otherwise be ignorant of us. An accident of the same kind happened to me a few days ago. Fabius Rufinus, a person of distinguished merit, was placed next to me at table, and below him a countryman of his, who had just then come to Rome for the first time. Rufinus, calling his friend's attention to me, said to him, "You see this man?" and entered into a conversation upon the subject of my pursuits; to whom the other immediately replied, "This must undoubtedly be Pliny." To confess the truth, I look upon these instances as a very considerable recompense of my labours. If Demosthenes had reason to be pleased with the old woman of Athens crying out, "This is Demosthenes," may not I, then, be allowed to congratulate myself upon the celebrity my name has acquired? Yes, my friend, I will rejoice in it, and without scruple admit that I do. As I only mention the judgment of others, not my own, I am not afraid of incurring the censure of vanity, especially from you who, whilst envying no man's reputation, are particularly zealous for mine. Farewell. CV To Sabinianus. I greatly approve of your having, in compliance with my letter, received again into your favour and family a discarded freedman, who you once admitted into a share of your affection. This will afford you, I doubt not, great satisfaction. It certainly has me, both as a proof that your passion can be controlled, and as an instance of your paying so much regard to me as either to yield to my authority or to comply with my request. Let me, therefore, at once both praise and thank you. At the same time I must advise you to be disposed for the future to pardon the faults of your people, though there should be none to intercede in their behalf. Farewell. End of Section 15. Section 16 of Letters of Pliny by Pliny the Younger, translated by William Melmoth, revised by F.C.T. Bosanquet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Letters 106 to 110. Letter 106 to Lupercus. I said once, and I think not inaptly, of a certain orator of the present age, whose compositions are extremely regular and correct, but deficient in grandeur and embellishment: his only fault is that he has none; whereas he, who is possessed of the true spirit of oratory, should be bold and elevated, and sometimes even flame out, be hurried away, and frequently tread upon the brink of a precipice; for danger is generally near whatever is towering and exalted. The plain, it is true, affords a safer, but for that reason a more humble and inglorious path. They who run are more likely to stumble than they who creep, but the latter gain no honour by not slipping, while the former even fall with glory. It is with eloquence as with some other arts: she is never more pleasing than when she risks most. Have you not observed what acclamations our rope dancers excite at the instant of imminent danger? Whatever is most entirely unexpected, or as the Greeks more strongly express it, whatever is most perilous, most excites our admiration. The pilot's skill is by no means equally proved in a calm as in a storm: in the former case he tamely enters the port, unnoticed and unapplauded; but when the cordage cracks, the mast bends, and the rudder groans, then it is that he shines out in all his glory, and is hailed as little inferior to a sea god. The reason of my making this observation is, because, if I mistake not, you have marked some passages in my writings for being tumid, exuberant, and overwrought, which, in my estimation, are but adequate to the thought, or boldly sublime. But it is material to consider whether your criticism turns upon such points as are real faults, or only striking and remarkable expressions. Whatever is elevated is sure to be observed, but it requires a very nice judgment to distinguish the bounds between true and false grandeur, between loftiness and exaggeration. To give an instance out of Homer, the author who can, with the greatest propriety, fly from one extreme of style to another: "Heaven in loud thunder bids the trumpets sound, And wide beneath them groans the rending ground." Again, "Reclined on clouds his steed and armour lay." So in this passage, as torrents roll, increased by numerous rills, with rage impetuous down their echoing hills, rush'd to the vales, and pour'd along the plain, roar through 1,000 channels to the main. It requires, I say, the nicest balance to poise these metaphors, and determine whether they are incredible and meaningless, or majestic and sublime. Not that I think anything which I have written, or can write, admits of comparison with these; I am not quite so foolish; but what I would be understood to contend for is, that we should give eloquence free rein, and not restrain the force and impetuosity of genius within too narrow a compass. But it will be said, perhaps, that one law applies to orators, another to poets; as if, in truth, Mark Tully were not as bold in his metaphors as any of the poets. But not to mention particular instances from him, in a point where, I imagine, there can be no dispute, does Demosthenes himself, that model and standard of true oratory, does Demosthenes check and repress the fire of his indignation in that well known passage which begins thus: "These wicked men, these flatterers, and these destroyers of mankind," etc.; and again, "It is neither with stones nor bricks that I have fortified this city," etc.; and afterwards, "I have thrown up these outworks before Attica, and pointed out to you all the resources which human prudence can suggest," etc.; and in another place, "O Athenians, I swear by the immortal gods that he is intoxicated with the grandeur of his own actions," etc. But what can be more daring and beautiful than that long digression which begins in this manner: "A terrible disease"? The following passage likewise, though somewhat shorter, is equally boldly conceived: "Then it was I rose up in opposition to the daring Pytho, who poured forth a torrent of menaces against you," etc. The subsequent stricture is of the same stamp: "When a man has strengthened himself, as Philip has, in avarice and wickedness, the first pretence, the first false step, be it ever so inconsiderable, has overthrown and destroyed all," etc. So in the same style with the foregoing is this: "Railed off, as it were, from the privileges of society, by the concurrent and just judgments of the 3 tribunals in the city." And in the same place, "O Aristogiton, you have betrayed that mercy which used to be shown to offences of this nature; or rather indeed you have wholly destroyed it. In vain then would you fly for refuge to a port, which you have shut up, and encompassed with rocks." He has said before, "I am afraid, therefore, you should appear in the judgment of some to have erected a public seminary of faction; for there is a weakness in all wickedness which renders it apt to betray itself." And a little lower, "I see none of these resources open to him, but all is precipice gulf and profound abyss." And again, "Nor do I imagine that our ancestors erected those courts of judicature, that men of his character should be planted there; but on the contrary eradicated, that none may emulate their evil actions." And afterwards, "If he is then the artificer of every wickedness, if he only makes it his trade and traffic," etc. And 1,000 other passages which I might cite to the same purpose; not to mention those expressions which Aeschines calls not words, but wonders. You will tell me, perhaps, I have unwarily mentioned Aeschines, since Demosthenes is condemned even by him for running into these figurative expressions. But observe, I entreat you, how far superior the former orator is to his critic, and superior too in the very passage to which he objects; for in others the force of his genius, in those above quoted, its loftiness, makes itself manifest. But does Aeschines himself avoid those errors which he reproves in Demosthenes? "The orator," says he, "Athenians, and the law ought to speak the same language; but when the voice of the law declares one thing, and that of the orator another, we should give our vote to the justice of the law, not to the impudence of the orator." And in another place, "He afterwards manifestly discovered the design he had, of concealing his fraud under cover of the decree, having expressly declared therein that the ambassadors sent to the Oretae gave the 5 talents not to you but to Callias; and that you may be convinced of the truth of what I say, after having stripped the decree of its galleys, its trim, and its arrogant ostentation, the clause itself." And in another part, "Suffer him not to break cover and escape out of the limits of the question," a metaphor he is so fond of that he repeats it again: "But remaining firm and confident in the assembly, drive him into the merits of the question, and observe well how he doubles." Is his style more reserved and simple when he says, "But you are ever wounding our ears, and are more concerned in the success of your daily harangues than for the salvation of the city?" What follows is conceived in a yet higher strain of metaphor: "Will you not expel this man as the common calamity of Greece? Will you not seize and punish this pirate of the state, who sails about in quest of favourable conjunctures?" etc.; with many other passages of a similar nature. And now I expect you will make the same attacks upon certain expressions in this letter, as you did upon those I have been endeavouring to defend: the rudder that groans, and the pilot compared to a sea god, will not, I imagine, escape your criticism; for I perceive, while I am suing for indulgence to my former style, I have fallen into the same kind of figurative diction which you condemn. But attack them if you please, provided you will immediately appoint a day when we may meet to discuss these matters in person. You will then either teach me to be less daring, or I shall teach you to be more bold. Farewell. CVII To Caninius. I have met with a story which, although authenticated by undoubted evidence, looks very like fable, and would afford a worthy field for the exercise of so exuberant, lofty, and truly poetical a genius as your own. It was related to me the other day over the dinner table, where the conversation happened to run upon various kinds of marvels. The person who told the story was a man of unsuspected veracity; but what has a poet to do with truth? However, you might venture to rely upon his testimony, even though you had the character of a faithful historian to support. There is in Africa a town called Hippo, situated not far from the sea coast. It stands upon a navigable lake, communicating with an estuary in the form of a river, which alternately flows into the lake, or into the ocean, according to the ebb and flow of the tide. People of all ages amuse themselves here with fishing, sailing, or swimming, especially boys, whom love of play brings to the spot. With these, it is a fine and manly achievement to be able to swim the furthest, and he that leaves the shore and his companions at the greatest distance gains the victory. It happened, in one of these trials of skill, that a certain boy, bolder than the rest, launched out towards the opposite shore. He was met by a dolphin, who sometimes swam before him, and sometimes behind him, then played round him, and at last took him upon his back, and set him down, and afterwards took him up again, and thus he carried the poor frightened fellow out into the deepest part, when immediately he turns back again to the shore, and lands him among his companions. The fame of this remarkable accident spread through the town, and crowds of people flocked round the boy, whom they viewed as a kind of prodigy, to ask him questions, and hear him relate the story. The next day the shore was thronged with spectators, all attentively watching the ocean, and (what indeed is almost itself an ocean) the lake. Meanwhile the boys swam as usual, and among the rest the boy I am speaking of went into the lake, but with more caution than before. The dolphin appeared again and came to the boy, who, together with his companions, swam away with the utmost precipitation. The dolphin, as though to invite and call them back, leaped and dived up and down in a series of circular movements. This he practised the next day, the day after, and for several days together, till the people, accustomed from their infancy to the sea, began to be ashamed of their timidity. They ventured, therefore, to advance nearer, playing with him and calling him to them, while he in return suffered himself to be touched and stroked. Use rendered them courageous. The boy in particular who first made the experiment swam by the side of him, and leaping upon his back was carried backwards and forwards in that manner, and thought the dolphin knew him and was fond of him, while he too had grown fond of the dolphin. There seemed now indeed to be no fear on either side, the confidence of the one and the tameness of the other mutually increasing, the rest of the boys in the meanwhile surrounding and encouraging their companion. It is very remarkable that this dolphin was followed by a second, which seemed only as a spectator and attendant on the former, for he did not at all submit to the same familiarities as the first, but only escorted him backwards and forwards, as the boys did their comrade. But what is further surprising, and no less true than what I have already related, is that this dolphin, who thus played with the boys and carried them upon his back, would come upon the shore, dry himself in the sand, and, as soon as he grew warm, roll back into the sea. It is a fact that Octavius Avitus, deputy governor of the province, actuated by an absurd piece of superstition, poured some ointment over him as he lay on the shore, the novelty and smell of which made him retire into the ocean, and it was not till several days after that he was seen again, when he appeared dull and languid. However, he recovered his strength and continued his usual playful tricks. All the magistrates round flocked hither to view this sight, whose arrival and prolonged stay was an additional expense, which the slender finances of this little community would ill afford. Besides, the quiet and retirement of the place was utterly destroyed. It was thought proper, therefore, to remove the occasion of this concourse, by privately killing the poor dolphin. And now, with what a flow of tenderness will you describe this affecting catastrophe, and how will your genius adorn and heighten this moving story! Though, indeed, the subject does not require any fictitious embellishments, it will be sufficient to describe the actual facts of the case without suppression or diminution. Farewell. CVIII To Fuscus. You want to know how I portion out my day in my summer villa at Tuscum. I get up just when I please, generally about sunrise, often earlier, but seldom later than this. I keep the shutters closed, as darkness and silence wonderfully promote meditation. Thus free and abstracted from these outward objects which dissipate attention, I am left to my own thoughts; nor suffer my mind to wander with my eyes, but keep my eyes in subjection to my mind, which, when they are not distracted by a multiplicity of external objects, see nothing but what the imagination represents to them. If I have any work in hand, this is the time I choose for thinking it out, word for word, even to the minutest accuracy of expression. In this way I compose more or less, according as the subject is more or less difficult, and I find myself able to retain it. I then call my secretary, and opening the shutters dictate to him what I have put into shape; after which I dismiss him, then call him in again and again dismiss him. About 10 or 11 o'clock (for I do not observe one fixed hour), according to the weather, I either walk upon my terrace or in the covered portico, and there I continue to meditate or dictate what remains upon the subject in which I am engaged. This completed, I get into my chariot, where I employ myself as before, when I was walking, or in my study, and find this change of scene refreshes and keeps up my attention. On my return home I take a little nap, then a walk, and after that repeat out loud and distinctly some Greek or Latin speech, not so much for the sake of strengthening my voice as my digestion, though indeed the voice at the same time is strengthened by this practice. I then take another walk, am anointed, do my exercises, and go into the bath. At supper, if I have only my wife or a few friends with me, some author is read to us; and after supper we are entertained either with music or an interlude. When that is finished, I take my walk with my family, among whom I am not without some scholars. Thus we pass our evenings in varied conversation, and the day, even when at the longest, steals imperceptibly away. Upon some occasions I change the order in certain of the articles above mentioned. For instance, if I have studied longer or walked more than usual, after my second sleep, and reading a speech or two aloud, instead of using my chariot, I get on horseback; by which means I ensure as much exercise, and lose less time. The visits of my friends from the neighbouring villages claim some part of the day, and sometimes, by an agreeable interruption, they come in very seasonably to relieve me when I am feeling tired. I now and then amuse myself with hunting, but always take my tablets into the field, that, if I should meet with no game, I may at least bring home something. Part of my time too, though not so much as they desire, is allotted to my tenants, whose rustic complaints, along with these city occupations, make my literary studies still more delightful to me. Farewell. CIX To Paulinus. As you are not of a disposition to expect from your friends the ordinary ceremonial observances of society, when they cannot observe them without inconvenience to themselves, so I love you too steadfastly to be apprehensive of your taking otherwise than I wish you should my not waiting upon you on the first day of your entrance upon the consular office, especially as I am detained here by the necessity of letting my farms upon long leases. I am obliged to enter upon an entirely new plan with my tenants; for under the former leases, though I made them very considerable abatements, they have run greatly in arrear. For this reason several of them have not only taken no sort of care to lessen a debt which they found themselves incapable of wholly discharging, but have even seized and consumed all the produce of the land, in the belief that it would now be of no advantage to themselves to spare it. I must, therefore, obviate this increasing evil, and endeavour to find out some remedy against it. The only one I can think of is, not to reserve my rent in money, but in kind, and so place some of my servants to overlook the tillage and guard the stock; as indeed there is no sort of revenue more agreeable to reason than what arises from the bounty of the soil, the seasons, and the climate. It is true, this method will require great honesty, sharp eyes, and many hands. However, I must risk the experiment, and, as in an inveterate complaint, try every change of remedy. You see, it is not any pleasurable indulgence that prevents my attending you on the first day of your consulship. I shall celebrate it nevertheless, as much as if I were present, and pay my vows for you here, with all the warmest tokens of joy and congratulation. Farewell. CX To Fuscus. You are much pleased, I find, with the account I gave you in my former letter of how I spend the summer season at Tusculum, and desire to know what alteration I make in my method when I am at Laurentum in the winter. None at all, except abridging myself of my sleep at noon, and borrowing a good piece of the night before daybreak and after sunset for study; and if business is very urgent, which in winter very frequently happens, instead of having interludes or music after supper, I reconsider whatever I have previously dictated, and improve my memory at the same time by this frequent mental revision. Thus I have given you a general sketch of my mode of life in summer and winter, to which you may add the intermediate seasons of spring and autumn, in which, while losing nothing out of the day, I gain but little from the night. Farewell. Section 17.